Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that drag you into the bizarre corners of history, with a side of dry wit and restless nights, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, we specialize in boring bedtime stories, because nothing soothes a sleepless mind like the absurdity of the past. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Noisy Mornings. In the dim, cobwebbed recesses of medieval Europe, where mornings arrived with all the grace of a drunkard stumbling into a pew, the concept of an alarm clock was less a convenience and more a waking nightmare. The modern world, with its gentle digital chimes and gradual light simulations, would have been met with outright suspicion. No, the medieval alarm clock was a creature of chaos, a feathered herald of suffering, the rooster. But not just any rooster. This was a rooster with anxiety. His name was Clovis, though no one ever called him that. To the villagers of Bramblick, he was simply that damned bird, a title muttered through clenched teeth as he shattered the fragile peace of dawn with the vocal equivalent of a dropped anvil. Clovis did not crow at sunrise. He crowed at shadows, at suspiciously shaped clouds, at the existential dread that surely plagued all creatures cursed with the awareness of their own mortality. His internal clock was less a finely tuned mechanism, and more a broken hourglass leaking sand at random intervals. The problem was not merely that Clovis was loud. It was that he was unpredictable. One morning, he might decide that the witching hour was the ideal time to announce his presence to the world, his screeches ricocheting off the thatched roofs like a deranged town crier. The next, he would remain ominously silent until the sun was high enough to mock the farmers who had overslept, their fields now baking under the unforgiving gaze of noon. Bramblewick's blacksmith, a man named Thaddeus, with 4 arms like tree trunks and a patience thinner than parchment, had once attempted to reason with Clovis. This involved a lengthy, one-sided conversation conducted at midnight, illuminated by the flickering light of a dying torch, in which Thaddeus explained, through gritted teeth, that roosters were supposed to crow at dawn, not at the sound of their own existential crises. Clovis had responded by flapping violently onto the blacksmith's head, and letting out a noise that could only be described as the avian equivalent of a philosophical scream. The village baker, Eleanor, had long since given up on sleep as a concept. Instead, she embraced the chaos, kneading dough at ungodly hours while Clovis serenaded her with his discordant soliloquies. She claimed he had a knack for predicting storms, though this was likely just her sleep-deprived brain trying to assign meaning to the bird's erratic behavior. "He's not anxious," she would say, wiping flour from her brow. "He's prophetic." The villagers disagreed. Then there was Brother Aldrich, the monastery's most beleaguered scribe, whose delicate work transcribing illuminated manuscripts was routinely ruined by Clovis' sudden outbursts. Ink splattered, parchment tore, and more than once Aldrich had accidentally drawn a decidedly unsaintly gesture in the margins of a psalm. The abbot, a man of infinite patience and questionable hearing, merely smiled and said, "God's creatures have their ways." Aldrich privately suspected God had nothing to do with it. As the weeks bled into months, Bramblewick's collective sanity frayed like a rope holding too much weight. The villagers began to see Clovis not as a mere bird, but as a feathered omen of their own unspoken anxieties. What if they, too, were merely crowing into the void, their routines as meaningless as his? What if the dawn they so relied upon was just another arbitrary line in the sand of time? And so, as the first light of another uncertain morning crept over the horizon, Clovis took a deep breath, or whatever passed for a deep breath in a rooster, and unleashed a cry so laden with existential despair that it shook the dew from the grass. Somewhere in the village, a child started crying. A dog howled in solidarity. Thaddeus groaned into his hands. And Eleanor, ever the optimist, whispered, "Maybe tomorrow he'll be on time." He would not be. Chapter 2. The Rooster's Royal Appointment. The idea that roosters should serve as the official timekeepers of medieval villages did not emerge from a place of wisdom. It emerged from a place of desperation, and more specifically, from the mind of a man who had spent too much time around chickens and not enough time questioning his own life choices. That man was Lord Oswin of Brambolik, a nobleman of middling importance and dubious intelligence, whose primary qualifications for governance were a hereditary title and an unshakable belief that roosters were, in fact, feathered scholars of the natural order. Oswin had once read, or more accurately had been read to, a passage from an ancient text claiming that roosters possessed an innate connection to the heavens. This was almost certainly a mistranslation, but Oswin was not one to let facts interfere with a good proclamation. Thus, on a damp Tuesday that smelled vaguely of wet hay and regret, Oswin declared that henceforth all official village timekeeping would be the sacred duty of roosters. The announcement was met with silence, followed by the sound of Brother Aldrich quietly weeping into his inkwell. The logic, if it could be called that, was simple. If roosters crowed at dawn and dawn marked the start of the workday, then roosters were clearly nature's timepiece. Never mind that Clovis had spent the last 6 months crowing at anything from a passing breeze to his own reflection in a rainwater puddle. Oswin was convinced that with proper training, or failing that sheer intimidation, roosters could be persuaded to adhere to a more disciplined schedule. The first step in this grand experiment was the selection of official village roosters. Each household was required to present their finest bird for inspection, a process that quickly devolved into chaos as chickens, geese, and one very confused turkey were shoved toward the bewildered lord's feet. Clovis, of course, had not been formally entered into the competition. He had, however, inserted himself into the proceedings by launching onto Oswin's shoulder mid-proclamation and letting out a shriek so piercing that the nobleman's left ear rang for 3 days. Against all reason, this display was interpreted as enthusiasm for civic duty. Clovis was appointed Brambolik's head timekeeper, a title that came with no tangible benefits, but did grant him the right to peck at anyone who questioned his authority. The other roosters, now dubbed the Dawn Council, were given ribbons tied around their legs to signify their status. These ribbons lasted approximately as long as it took for the birds to realize they were edible. Within hours, the village square was strewn with colorful scraps and the faint sounds of digestive regret. Training the roosters proved even less successful. The initial plan involved a system of rewards, handfuls of grain for punctual crowing, stern glares for tardiness. Unfortunately, roosters are not creatures of reason, nor are they particularly motivated by the promise of future snacks. The Dawn Council took the grain and then crowed whenever they pleased, which was often at times that could only be described as spiteful. One particularly rebellious bird, later nicknamed Sir Crows-a-Lot, developed a habit of screaming directly into the open windows of villagers who had dared to complain about his timing. Meanwhile, Clovis, now burdened with the weight of bureaucratic expectation, began to exhibit even more erratic behavior. Some days, he would crow before the first hint of light, jolting the village awake with the urgency of a man who had just remembered he left the oven on. Other days, he would remain silent until noon, leaving the villagers in a state of nervous anticipation, glancing at the sky as if the sun itself had forgotten its duty. The blacksmith, Thaddeus, whose work required at least a semblance of reliable daylight, took to muttering darkly about roasted poultry. The baker, Eleanor, began leaving out small offerings of bread crusts in an attempt to bribe Clovis into something resembling consistency. Brother Aldrich, now on the verge of a monastic meltdown, took to inscribing his manuscripts with increasingly uncharitable marginalia, including a particularly detailed sketch of a rooster being launched from a catapult. Lord Oswin, oblivious to the growing unrest, remained convinced of his own genius. He even commissioned a small wooden plaque for Clovis, declaring him keeper of the divine hours, which the bird immediately attempted to eat. By the end of the first month, the entire village was operating on a schedule that could only be described as vaguely diurnal. Farmers tilled fields under the light of the moon, mistaking Sir Crow's-a-Lot's midnight serenades for a sign of impending dawn. Merchants opened their stalls at random intervals, leading to a thriving black market in naps. The local tavern, sensing opportunity, began serving sunrise ale at all hours, claiming that if the roosters couldn't decide when morning was, neither would they. The breaking point came when a traveling merchant, unaware of Bramblewick's avian timekeeping crisis, arrived at what he believed was dawn, only to find the entire village asleep, the streets empty save for Clovis, who was locked in a staring contest with his own shadow. The merchant's subsequent report to the regional magistrate painted Bramblewick as a village governed by poultry and plagued by collective madness. Lord Oswin, finally sensing the tide of public opinion turning against him, attempted to salvage the situation by announcing that roosters were, in fact, merely advisors to the timekeeping process, and that humans could, if they absolutely had to, use alternate methods such as looking at the sky. The Dawn Council was unofficially disbanded, though no one had the heart to tell the roosters, who continued to crow with the chaotic enthusiasm of creatures blissfully unaware of their own redundancy. Clovis, for his part, remained Bramblewick's head timekeeper in name only, a title he wore with the same dignity he applied to everything else, which is to say, none at all. He spent his days terrorizing the local dogs, staring into the middle distance as if contemplating the futility of existence, and occasionally, just occasionally, crowing at something approximating dawn. And so, the experiment in avian timekeeping faded into history, remembered only in the weary sighs of early risers and the occasional nightmare of Brother Aldrich. The villagers returned to their imperfect, human-run schedules, though they would never again look at a rooster without a twinge of unease. Somewhere in the annals of forgotten ideas, the notion of roosters as timekeepers remains, a testament to humanity's eternal struggle to impose order on a world that insists on being delightfully, infuriatingly unpredictable. Chapter 3. A Fowl with a Nervous Disposition. Clovis was not like other roosters. While most of his kind strutted through life with the bravado of tiny, feathered kings, Clovis carried himself with the perpetual air of a creature convinced the sky might at any moment take personal offense and fall directly upon him. His crow was not the confident trumpet of a herald announcing the sun's arrival, but the jagged, wavering cry of a being who had just remembered that existence was a precarious condition with no guaranteed safety net. His anxiety was not entirely without cause. The world, as Clovis understood it, was a minefield of potential disasters. Shadows moved without explanation. The wind made noises that sounded like whispered conspiracies. Other roosters gave him looks that could only be described as judgmental. Even the ground beneath his feet was suspect. What if it decided one day to simply stop being solid? These were the thoughts that haunted Clovis in the quiet hours, which for him were few and far between. His crowing, once a simple biological function, had evolved into a complex and deeply personal form of existential protest. Some mornings he crowed because the sun was rising, and that seemed like something a rooster ought to acknowledge. Other times he crowed because he had just realized that the concept of time was an illusion, and if no one else was going to panic about it, he would. Occasionally, he crowed because he had seen a leaf move in a way he didn't like. The villagers of Bramblewick had long since given up trying to predict Clovis's behavior. They had, through grim necessity, developed a system of interpreting his moods based on the tone and timing of his outbursts. A short, sharp crow at midnight usually meant he had been startled by his own feet. A prolonged, warbling shriek at dawn suggested he had just remembered that everyone he knew would someday die. The rare, almost melodic crow, usually delivered around mid-morning on days when the weather was neither too hot nor too cold, was the closest thing Clovis had to contentment, and the villagers treasured these moments like rare coins. The other roosters of Bramblewick regarded Clovis with a mixture of pity and disdain. Sir Crow's-a-Lot, the self-appointed leader of the Dawn Council, a title he had awarded himself after pecking the runner-up in the face, considered Clovis an embarrassment to their kind. "You're a rooster," he had clucked once, with the condescension of a creature who had never once questioned his place in the universe. "You have one job. Do it with dignity." Clovis had responded by fluffing his feathers nervously and crowing directly into a nearby bucket, the sound echoing in a way that made several villagers spill their breakfast ale. Even the hens, normally indifferent to the dramas of roosterdom, found Clovis perplexing. Gertrude, a particularly no-nonsense hen with a stare that could curdle milk, had once attempted to console him. "Listen," she had said in the tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a very small child. "The sun comes up, you crow. The sun goes down, you sleep. It's not complicated." Clovis had considered this for a long moment, before letting out a soft, despairing cluck and wandering off to stare at a patch of dirt as if it held the answers to all his problems. The humans, for their part, had developed their own coping mechanisms. Thaddeus the blacksmith had taken to wearing earplugs fashioned from beeswax, though these did little to muffle the sheer force of Clovis' existential announcements. Eleanor the baker had begun leaving out small piles of grain in strategic locations, hoping to lure Clovis into a routine, but this only resulted in the rooster developing a new anxiety about whether he was eating too much or too little. Brother Aldrich, in a moment of weakness, had briefly considered exorcism before remembering that the church had strict opinions on which creatures were eligible for such services. Lord Oswin, still clinging to the tattered remains of his rooster-based timekeeping experiment, insisted that Clovis's behavior was evidence of a sensitive and artistic temperament. This opinion was not shared by the rest of Bramberwick, who had begun to suspect that their lord's fascination with poultry was less about civic duty and more about a deeply misplaced sense of kinship. And then there were the days when Clovis didn't crow at all. These were, in some ways, worse than his outbursts. The village would wake to an eerie silence, the kind that suggested the universe was holding its breath. Farmers would pause in their fields, glancing at the sky as if expecting it to crack open. Children would tiptoe to school, unnerved by the absence of their usual alarm. Even the other roosters would fall into an uncharacteristic quiet, as though waiting for permission to make noise. On these days, Clovis could usually be found in some secluded corner of the village, staring into the middle distance with the intensity of a philosopher who had just realized that all of his theories were wrong. Sometimes he would peck listlessly at the ground, as if hoping to unearth some profound truth. Other times he would simply sit, motionless, his feathers ruffled in a way that suggested deep internal turmoil. It was during one of these silent spells that Gertrude found him huddled behind the blacksmith's shop, looking for all the world like a feathery representation of the word overwhelm. She regarded him for a long moment before sighing. "You're thinking again, aren't you?" Clovis didn't respond, but the slight droop of his comb was answer enough. Gertrude clucked softly. "That's your problem. You think too much." Clovis turned his head slightly, fixing her with one gleaming, haunted eye. Then, with the solemnity of a creature who had just reached a terrible and inescapable conclusion, he let out a slow, shuddering crow that sounded less like an announcement of dawn and more like a lament for all the inevitable tragedies of existence. Gertrude blinked. "Well," she said, after a pause, "that was dramatic." And with that, she wandered off, leaving Clovis to his thoughts, his fears, and the unshakable certainty that the world was a vast and terrifying place. But at least for the moment, the sky was still where it belonged. The villagers, hearing his crow at last, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The world, however unpredictable, was back on its axis. Life, however absurd, would continue. And Clovis, ever the reluctant herald of chaos, would keep crowing, not because he wanted to, but because the universe, in its infinite cruelty, had given him no other choice. Chapter 4. The Farmer's Desperate Plea. The straw that broke the farmer's back, quite literally, as he stumbled over a hay bale in his sleep-deprived stupor, came when Clovis developed a new habit of crowing exclusively during the 2 hours each night, when human sleep is deepest and most sacred. Farmer Gundrig, A man whose patience had been worn thinner than the soles of his work boots woke for the 7th consecutive night to that familiar ear-splitting shriek at precisely the moment when dreams become something worth remembering. This particular midnight aria found Gundrick halfway through a particularly pleasant dream about a cheese that never ran out. As Clovis's cry tore through the quiet like a rusty saw through green wood, the phantom cheese vanished, replaced by the grim reality of pre-dawn darkness, and the growing certainty that his rooster was, in fact, the devil's own alarm clock. Gundrick's wife, Hilda, had taken to sleeping in the barn with the pigs months ago, claiming their snores were more predictable than Clovis's outbursts. The children had developed a game where they placed bets on what ungodly hour the rooster would next disturb the peace. The family dog now whimpered at the sight of feathers. Something had to be done. At first light, actual first light, not Clovis's personal interpretation of it, Gundrick trudged through the morning mist to the crooked hut of old Mother Wag, the village's resident wise woman, cunning woman, and occasional taker of naps when no one was looking. The hut smelled overwhelmingly of dried herbs and questionable life choices. A raven perched above the door gave Gundrick a look that suggested it knew all his worst secrets. Mother Wag herself sat stirring a pot of something that bubbled with the enthusiasm of a swamp. "Ah," she said without turning around, "the man with the demon rooster." Gundrick blinked. "How did you—" "Whole village knows, boy. Whole village hears. Whole village has considered chicken stew as a solution." She finally turned, fixing him with eyes that had seen too much and found most of it lacking. "So, your bird." Gundrick collapsed onto a stool that creaked ominously. "It's not natural, Mother Wag. Last week he crowed 17 times during the new moon. 17. I counted. Yesterday he started up because a cloud looked at him funny." He ran a hand through hair that had begun graying at an alarming rate since Clovis entered his life. "I swear on my grandmother's grave, that bird knows when I'm about to fall asleep and takes it personal." Mother Wag nodded sagely, stirring her pot with a bone that might have been from a chicken, which Gundrick chose not to think about too hard. "You think he's cursed?" "I think he's something," Gundrick groaned. "Normal roosters don't have existential crises at 3 in the morning. Normal roosters don't try to warn the hens about the inevitability of death during feeding time. That bird's got more nerves than a fresh-cut ham, and we're all paying for it." The wise woman studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Two possibilities here. One, bird's got a touch of the sight, wakes when he senses unnatural things about." Gundrick paled. "Unnatural things? Like what?" "Oh, you know." She waved a gnarled hand. "Ghosts, imps, the creeping dread of mortal existence. Standard night fare." "And the second possibility?" "Second possibility," Mother Wag said, taking a loud slurp from her suspicious brew, "is your rooster's just an arse." Gundrick put his head in his hands. "I can do a curse test," she offered. "Simple thing. Egg, some herbs, a drop of your blood." "My blood?" "Always blood with these things, boy. Don't flinch, you want answers or not." What Gundrick wanted was 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, and possibly a new life as a shepherd in the next valley over. But he settled for nodding weakly. The ritual, as it turned out, involved considerably more chicken feathers and interpretive dance than Gundrick had anticipated. Mother Wag circled the suspicious egg, procured from Clovis's least anxious hen, while chanting words that sounded suspiciously like the recipe for barley soup. The raven cawed at dramatic intervals. At one point, all the candles blew out despite there being no discernible breeze, which Gundrick felt was showing off. Finally, the egg cracked itself open with a sound like a walnut giving up on life. Mother Wag peered into its glistening insides with the intensity of a woman reading particularly scandalous gossip. "Where?" Gundrick asked. "Interesting," she murmured. "What's interesting? Is he cursed? Can we fix it?" Should I be worried about ghosts? Mother Wag licked a bit of egg from her finger. Mostly I'm wondering why this hen's been eating so much garlic. But as for your bird, she frowned at the yolky remains. No curse, no possession, no eldritch influence that I can see. Gundrik's shoulders slumped. So he's just an arse, Mother Wag confirmed. She patted his arm in what might have been meant as comfort. Some creatures are born anxious, boy. Some have anxiety thrust upon them. Your rooster seems to be the sort who'd find something to worry about in paradise. The walk home felt longer than usual. Gundrik kicked at stones, muttering to himself about early graves and feather pillows. As he rounded the bend to his farm, a familiar sound tore through the morning air. Clovis, announcing to all creation that he just remembered that eventually the sun would explode and take them all with it. From the barn doorway, Hilda gave him a look that said clearer than words, "Well?" Gundrik sighed. "We're keeping the rooster." Hilda sighed too, deeper, with the weariness of a woman who'd known this would be the answer all along. "I'll tell the children to start betting on how long until you snap and cook him." Somewhere nearby, Clovis crowed again. This time, Gundrik swore with a hint of smugness. The farmer stared up at the sky, wondering if other villages had this problem, or if Bramblewick was uniquely cursed with the world's most neurotic alarm clock. As if in answer, Sir Crowsalot from the next farm let out a perfectly timed, perfectly normal morning crow. Gundrik closed his eyes. Somewhere, a god was laughing at him. Chapter 5. The Witch's Dubious Remedy. 3 days after determining Clovis was not cursed, but simply built wrong, Mother Wag appeared at Gundrik's farm, carrying a basket that smelled like a forest fire had mated with a spice merchant's nightmare. The rooster in question was currently engaged in his morning routine of staring at a puddle like it contained the secrets of the universe, occasionally starting violently when his own reflection moved. When his own reflection moved. Right then, Mother Wag announced, plunking her basket on Gundrik's table hard enough to make his one decent mug rattle. "We're fixing your bird." Gundrik eyed the basket's contents with growing unease. "When you say fixing," calming, soothing, convincing his tiny feathered brain that the sky isn't about to fall on him specifically. She pulled out bundles of herbs tied with what looked suspiciously like human hair. First, the ritual cleansing. Then the potion. Then, if all else fails, we try reasoning with him. Hilda, who had emerged from the barn at the sound of potential solutions, snorted into her apron. The cleansing ritual involved circling Clovis 7 times counterclockwise, while sprinkling him with a mixture of lavender, crushed snail shells, and something Mother Wag referred to only as Virgin's Delight, which she assured them was perfectly respectable when Gundrik choked on his ale. Clovis endured this with the air of a martyr, occasionally letting out soft clucks that translated roughly to, "I don't understand why this is happening to me." "Now the chant," Mother Wag instructed, producing a ram's horn from her robes. Gundrik blinked. "Where were you keeping?" "Quiet, boy. Repeat after me." What followed was a series of syllables that might have been ancient words of power, or possibly just Mother Wag making sounds to amuse herself. Clovis fluffed his feathers in alarm when the horn sounded, nearly taking flight when the final note ended with a suspiciously flatulent wobble. The potion brewing was an ordeal that required 3 chickens, unrelated to the ritual, just for lunch. A cauldron that bubbled suspiciously even before being placed over the fire, and ingredients that included but were not limited to mushrooms that pulsed faintly in rhythm, the tears of a man who had stubbed his toe, collected from Gundrik after some creative encouragement. The resulting concoction shimmered with an unnatural purple hue that seemed to shift colors when no one was looking directly at it. It smelled like a meadow after rain. if the meadow had been recently used for questionable burial practices. Right, Mother Wag said, stirring the potion with a bone that might have been a finger. Now we administer it. Clovis took one look at the smoking bowl being carried toward him, and immediately developed a sudden keen interest in the far side of the barnyard. What followed was a chase that would be memorialized in village lore for generations, involving two grown adults, an old woman with terrifying dexterity, and one panicked rooster who was absolutely certain this was how his tragic backstory would begin. After an incident with a rain barrel and some language that made even the pigs blush, they cornered Clovis near the turnip patch. Mother Wag moved with the speed of a woman who had dealt with unwilling patients before, grabbing the rooster in a hold that pinned his wings, while Gundrick pried his beak open. The potion went down in 3 horrifying gulps, accompanied by sounds no chicken should ever make. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Clovis's comb turned a soft shade of blue. Then he began to glow faintly around the edges. Then he sat down very suddenly, as if all his bones had been removed. "Well," Mother Wag said, wiping her hands on her robes. "That's that." Gundrick stared at his now luminous rooster. Is he supposed to glow? No, but the alternative was spontaneous combustion, so count your blessings. Clovis made a soft noise like a deflating bellows and gazed up at the sky with newfound wonder. His next crow was melodic, almost contemplative, the sound of a rooster who had just discovered inner peace and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. The effect lasted precisely until sunset, when the potion wore off with violent suddenness. Clovis's feathers stood on end, like he'd been struck by lightning. His eyes widened in fresh existential horror, and he let out a shriek that summoned half the village to their windows before bolting into the night at speeds previously thought impossible for poultry. As the sound of panic clucking faded into the distance, Mother Wag nodded sagely. Might need to adjust the dosage. Gundrick put his head in his hands. Somewhere in the darkness, Clovis rediscovered all his anxieties at once, and began crowing a lament for the inevitable heat death of the universe. The next morning, Farmer Gundrick showed up at Mother Wag's hut with bloodshot eyes and a pouch of coins. "Just give me the one that makes him sleep for a week." Mother Wag smiled her toothless smile. "Now you're talking sense, boy." Chapter 6. The Rooster's Existential Crisis. Clovis had always known in some vague, feathery way that his existence was tied to the sun. He was a rooster. It was his job to announce dawn, to slice through the quiet with his voice and remind the world that time moved forward, whether anyone wanted it to or not. But as he perched on the fence post in the violet hour before sunrise, watching the first pale streaks of light bleed across the horizon, he found himself wondering, why? The humans didn't appreciate it. That much was obvious. Gundrick's face, whenever Clovis crowed at what was objectively the correct time, which in Clovis' mind was any time he felt like crowing, twisted into an expression that suggested the farmer was seriously reconsidering his stance on animal cruelty. The hens barely acknowledged his announcements unless he startled them into scattering. Even the other roosters, simple, uncomplicated creatures who crowed because that was what roosters did, seemed to regard his more philosophical outbursts with the same mild confusion one might reserve for a drunk philosopher in a tavern. Was this all there was? A life spent screaming into the void only for the void to groan and roll over? Clovis shifted his talons uneasily against the wood. The wind rustled through his feathers, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the distant wood smoke tang of the village. Somewhere in the fields, a hare bolted for cover, though dawn was still a whisper away. The world moved on, indifferent. A particularly sharp gust of wind made him fluff up his feathers, and for a moment he teetered on the fence post, wings flapping wildly to regain balance. His heart hammered against his ribs, a tiny, frantic drumbeat of panic. What if he fell? What if this was the time he didn't catch himself? What if he plummeted to the ground in an undignified heap, and the hens saw? He dug his claws deeper into the wood and took a steadying breath, or what passed for a breath in a creature with avian lungs. This was ridiculous. He was a rooster. Roosters didn't whine thunder. They didn't question their place in the grand scheme of things. They crowed. They strutted. They occasionally pecked at things to see if they were edible. And yet, Clovis turned his gaze skyward, where the last stubborn star still clung to the fading dark. His ancestors, wild, sharp-eyed birds who had fled the first attempts at domestication, had lived by instinct alone. They had not wasted time wondering about purpose. They had not lain awake at night worrying whether their crows were meaningful. But Clovis was not his ancestors. Perhaps that was the problem. The first true light of dawn crested the hills, spilling gold across the fields. The world sharpened into focus. The dew on the grass, the distant curl of smoke from the village chimneys. The way the air itself seemed to hum with the promise of morning. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Clovis opened his beak, and then hesitated. What if this time no one listened? What if this time his voice was just another sound lost in the indifferent rush of the world? What if the sun rose regardless, the humans woke regardless, the day began regardless, and nothing he did mattered at all? His throat tightened. Somewhere in the distance, Sir Crows-a-Lot let out a robust, uncomplicated dee-cock-a-doodle-doon, utterly untroubled by the weight of existence. Clovis envied him. And then, because the sun was rising, and he was a rooster, and some things were too deeply ingrained to fight, he drew in a breath and his crow came out shaky. Thin, but more of a question than a declaration. The wind carried it away before it had even finished. No one stirred in the farmhouse. No heads turned. The world did not pause to acknowledge him. Clovis sat very still, and for the first time in his noisy, chaotic life, he did not crow again. The change was not immediately noticeable. Gundrick woke at dawn out of habit, blinking blearily at the pale light creeping through the shutters. It took him a full minute to realize what was missing. Silence. Blessed, unnatural silence. He sat up slowly, half convinced he was still dreaming. No pre-dawn screeching. No existential poultry wailing. No Clovis. He crept to the window and peered out. The rooster was still there, perched on his usual fence post, but he was quiet, unnervingly so. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. His feathers lay flat, his comb dull in the morning light. Gundrick had spent months dreaming of this moment. Why did it feel so wrong? They set on following. Is a beyond day. By midday, the entire village had noticed. Eleanor paused in her kneading to glance toward the fields. No morning serenade from Clovis. Thaddeus, who had developed a nervous twitch from months of abrupt awakenings, kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting an ambush. Maybe he's sick, he muttered, though he sounded more suspicious than concerned. Brother Aldrich, passing by with an armful of manuscripts, paused to squint at the sky. Do you think he's thinking? The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. A thinking Clovis was a dangerous prospect. Clovis, unaware of the growing unease, had relocated to the roof of the barn, where he could stare at the horizon without interruption. The question still gnawed at him. What was the point? The sun rose without his announcement. The humans woke without his prompting. The world moved forward, heedless of his voice. Did he matter at all? A shadow passed over him, a hawk circling lazily on the thermals. Clovis watched it with a strange, detached curiosity. The hawk did not crow. It did not announce dawn. It simply wasn't die. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps he wasn't sure. The wind ruffled his feathers, carrying with it the scent of turned earth and the distant murmur of the village. Somewhere below, Gertrude the hen clucked irritably at a wandering chick. Life went on. Clovis closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he let the dawn pass without a sound. Chapter 7. The Village in Chaos. For 3 days, Bramblewick existed in a state of uneasy quiet. The villagers crept about their business with the tentative steps of men and women walking across thin ice, waiting for the inevitable crack. But Clovis remained silent. No midnight shrieks, no existential crowing, not even a half-hearted cluck at passing clouds. The rooster had become a feathery statue, perched on his fence post with an expression that suggested he had seen the true nature of the universe and found it lacking. At first, Gundrick enjoyed the novelty of uninterrupted sleep. He woke naturally with the sun, stretched without wincing at phantom rooster-shaped terrors, and even whistled as he fed the pigs. Hilda moved back into the house, though she kept one eye on Clovis at all times, as if expecting him to explode. But by the 4th day, the cracks began to show. Without Clovis's erratic but reliable announcements, the village lost all sense of time. Thaddeus the blacksmith, who had spent months cursing the rooster's pre-dawn serenades, woke in the middle of the night convinced it was morning. The rhythmic clang of his hammer rang through Bramblewick at an hour normally reserved for ghosts and bad decisions. By the time he realized his mistake, half the village was awake, including Brother Aldrich, who arrived at the forge clutching a prayer book and demanding to know if the end times had come. Eleanor the baker, deprived of her usual dawn alarm, slept straight through sunrise and only woke when the sun was high enough to bake bread directly on the windowsill. The villagers, expecting their morning loaves, stood outside her shop in growing confusion until someone pounded on her door hard enough to rattle the flour sacks. She emerged bleary-eyed, her hair full of dough, and promptly declared that all bread would now be served when it's done, and anyone who complained could learn to bake themselves. The fields fared no better. Farmers arrived at their plots at wildly different hours, some working by moonlight, while others napped under midday sun. Crops were watered twice in some places, not at all in others. A particularly confused shepherd began leading his flock out at dusk, returning them at dawn, and insisting this was how it had always been done. Lord Oswin, upon being informed that his official village timekeeper had apparently retired from his post, stroked his chin thoughtfully and suggested they just guess. This did not help. By the end of the week, Bramblewick had descended into full-blown temporal anarchy. Children showed up for lessons at midnight. The tavern served breakfast ale to farmers coming off their morning ploughing at sunset. The village crier, having given up entirely, simply walked the streets yelling whatever hour felt right at the time. Gundrick found Mother Wag stirring a suspiciously ordinary stew outside her hut. "It's your fault, you know," he said without preamble. She squinted up at him. "My fault? The village can't tell time without a neurotic chicken." "You broke him," Gundrick insisted, jerking a thumb toward where Clovis sat motionless on the fence. "He used to be, well, loud and annoying, but at least we knew where we stood. Now look at us." He gestured wildly at the general chaos, a passing shepherd whistling at what was either very late or very early, depending on perspective. Mother Wag sniffed. "Birds having a moment. Happens to the best of us. A moment. Existential reckoning. Crisis of purpose. You ever stop to wonder why you do what you do, farmer?" Gundrick opened his mouth, closed it, considered the question for the first time in his 40-odd years of rising before dawn, working until his hands bled, and collapsing into bed too tired to dream. A strange, uncomfortable feeling settled in his chest. He shook it off. "That's not the point. The point is your village is lost without something to scream at the darkness for you," Mother Wag interrupted. She jabbed her spoon at him. "You lot spent months complaining about that bird's noise. Now he's quiet, and you're all wandering around like babies who lost their rattle." Gundrick had no response to that. Back at the farm, Hilda stood watching Clovis with her arms crossed. "You think he's sick?" "No. Gundrick said, surprising himself. I think he's thinking. Hilda gave him a look usually reserved for when he suggested stacking firewood uphill. That night, something peculiar happened. Gundrick, awake at an hour that was either very late or very early, heard it first. A sound so faint he thought it might be the wind. He crept to the window. Clovis stood in the moonlight, staring at his own shadow. And then, very softly, he crowed. Not the ear-splitting shriek of existential dread. Not the panicked wail of a bird who had just remembered mortality. Just a crow. Quiet, tot vivant in dad. It says this in Canada. Uncertainty, she. But there. Gundrick held his breath. Clovis shook his feathers, tilted his head, and tried again, stronger this time. The sound drifted across the sleeping village, slipping under doors and through shuttered windows. In the forge, Thaddeus paused mid-swing, blinking at his hammer as if seeing it for the first time. Eleanor, elbow-deep in tomorrow's dough, lifted her head. Brother Aldrich, halfway through a marginal sketch of what might have been a very angry saint, set down his quill. The crow came again, tentative but clearer. The sound of a rooster remembering what he was. By the time the true dawn broke, Clovis was back on his fence post, crowing with all the chaotic glory of a creature who had briefly forgotten his place in the world, and was now making up for lost time. The villagers, bleary-eyed and oddly grateful, stumbled into the streets blinking like survivors of a long storm. The blacksmith lit his forge at a reasonable hour. The baker pulled fresh loaves from the oven. The farmers hit the fields as the dew was still burning off the grass. And high above them all, Clovis crowed. Not because he had to, but because somewhere in the quiet dark he had remembered that even in a world that didn't need him, his voice still mattered. The village for once didn't complain. Chapter 8. The Monk's Unholy Experiment. Brother Aldrich had reached his limit. 3 nights of interrupted sleep, first by Thaddeus' midnight hammering, then by the village children, attempting to play guess the hour outside the monastery walls, and finally by what sounded like Clovis conducting a full Avian opera beneath his window, had frayed the last thread of his monastic patience. He stormed into the abbey library with the desperate energy of a man who had just discovered the 10th circle of hell was in fact a rooster coop. Dust flew as he yanked ancient manuscripts from shelves, scattering priceless illuminations across the stone floor in his search for one particular text. A De Horologio Animalis, a heretical 9th century treatise on training animals as timekeepers. The abbot had expressly forbidden its reading, which Aldrich took as endorsement enough. The manuscript smelled of mildew and bad decisions. Aldrich blew dust from its pages, squinting at the cramped Latin that described, between worrying passages about goat sacrifice, how Saint Drogo of Flanders had allegedly trained a sparrow to sing the hours. The method involved chanting, strict fasting, and something called lunar synchronization that sounded suspiciously like witchcraft. Aldrich snapped the book shut. He would civilize this feathered menace through the sacred discipline of monastic routine. God had given man dominion over beasts, and if that dominion required a few adjustments to Benedictine rule, so be it. Thus began what would later be known in Bramblick's oral history as the week no one slept. Aldrich's plan was simple in its hubris. He would condition Clovis to associate food with the canonical hours. Matins would be marked by a single kernel of corn. Laus too, primed through Compline, followed accordingly, building to Vesper's grand reward of 7 whole kernels, a veritable feast by monastic standards. The theory was sound. The execution was something between them, a farce and an act of divine retribution. Clovis took one look at the monk standing in the barnyard with a bag of corn and immediately developed a new anxiety about religious zealotry. He backed away, head bobbing in alarm, as Aldrich began chanting the opening psalm of Matins in a tone usually reserved for exorcisms. "Try the corn!" Aldrich hissed through clenched teeth when Clovis refused to approach. Clovis eyed the colonel, like it might be a test of faith. By the third day, Aldrich had abandoned subtlety. He rigged a system of pulleys using monastery bell ropes to lower a corn-filled bucket at precise intervals. This resulted in Clovis developing a Pavlovian fear of ropes rather than any understanding of liturgy. When the bucket descended for prime, the rooster fled into the woods with a shriek that startled a nearby hermit into early penance. Under Terret, Aldrich progressed to visual aids, illuminated manuscripts held aloft at each hour, the holy images meant to inspire punctuality. This backfired spectacularly when Clovis became obsessed with a particularly gilded depiction of St. Francis and began attacking the parchment whenever it appeared, sending priceless vellum flying in a storm of feathers and monkish despair. The breaking point came at none on the 6th day, when Aldrich, now operating on approximately 2 hours of sleep and a dangerous quantity of monastery ale, attempted to demonstrate proper crowing technique. His imitation of Clovis's dawn aria, delivered from the abbey roof at what was definitely not the canonical hour, summoned the abbot from his meditation with the speed of a man who had just heard the sound of his order's reputation crumbling. "What in the name of all that is holy are you doing, Brother Aldrich?" Aldrich, caught mid-crow with his robes hitched up like makeshift wings, could only gesture wildly toward where Clovis watched from a safe distance, clearly reevaluating his life choices. "Temporal discipline," he croaked. The abbot pinched the bridge of his nose. "You're trying to train the rooster. Monastic tradition has never involved poultry, Aldrich." Clovis chose this moment to finally participate in the experiment, by unleashing a crow so perfectly timed to the actual hour of none that both monks froze. It was flawless. It was precise. It was everything Aldrich had dreamed of. And then Clovis ruined it by immediately crowing 6 more times in rapid succession, just to prove he could. The abbot sighed. "Brother Aldrich, you will spend the next month copying penitential psalms, and for the love of heaven leave God's creatures to their God-given natures." As Aldrich slunk back to the scriptorium, Clovis followed at a safe distance, occasionally tilting his head as if studying the defeated slope of the monk's shoulders. When Aldrich collapsed onto his stool with a groan, the rooster lingered in the doorway, then strutted forward and deposited a single kernel of corn on the monk's foot. Aldrich stared at it. Clovis stared back. Somewhere in the distance, the monastery bells rang out the actual hour of vespers. Neither of them moved. Eventually, Aldrich sighed and pushed the corn toward the rooster with the toe of his sandal. "Keep it. You've earned it." Clovis pecked at the offering thoughtfully, then wandered back into the sunlight, leaving the monk to his manuscripts and the dawning realization that some creatures, like some men, were simply not meant to keep perfect time. Chapter 9. The Rooster's Rebellion. The straw that broke the rooster's spirit came on a Tuesday, though no one in Bramblewick could agree which Tuesday it was any more. Brother Aldrich's failed experiment had left Clovis with a profound sense of betrayal, a mild corn addiction, and the dawning realization that the entire village saw him as nothing more than a malfunctioning timepiece with feathers. He'd spent weeks being chased, chanted at, force-fed questionable potions, and subjected to increasingly desperate attempts to regulate his inner clock. The monk's liturgical corn, the witch's glowing elixirs, the blacksmith's muttered threats, all of it culminated one evening as Clovis perched on his fence post, watching the sunset bleed across the field. A terrible thought occurred to him. What if he simply stopped? Not the anxious pauses of his existential crisis, not the quiet contemplation after Mother Wag's potion wore off. A full, deliberate refusal. A protest. A strike. The idea took root in his small avian brain with terrifying clarity. That night, when the moon hung fat and heavy over Bramblewick, Clovis tucked his beak under his wing and made a decision. He would not crow. Not at false dawn. Not at true dawn. Not even when that particularly irritating cloud shaped like a sheep passed overhead. Let them wake themselves for once. The first morning of silence was unsettling. Farmers rolled over in their beds, waiting for the familiar shriek that never came. The village stirred slowly, uneasily, as if the world itself had forgotten to turn. Gundrick woke with a start when the sun was already high, convinced he'd overslept his own funeral. Thaddeus the blacksmith lit his forge 3 hours late and spent the afternoon hammering out his frustrations on perfectly good horseshoes. By midday, the entire village had gathered in the square, blinking like owls dragged into sunlight. "Has anyone seen Clovis?" Eleanor asked, kneading a loaf that should have been in the oven hours ago. "Maybe he's dead," Thaddeus offered hopefully. A quick search revealed Clovis alive and well, sitting atop the church roof with the serene expression of a bird who had just discovered the power of collective bargaining. The second day brought chaos. Without their feathery alarm clock, the villagers' schedules unraveled completely. Children arrived at school as supper was being served. The tavern ran out of breakfast ale by midnight. Brother Aldrich attempted to ring the monastery bells according to the canonical hours, but kept falling asleep mid-pull, resulting in a discordant jangling that frightened the livestock. On the third day, Lord Oswin issued a proclamation declaring that time was now a personal matter, and that all citizens should follow their hearts regarding waking hours. This resulted in the village crier announcing noon at sunset and several farmers attempting to harvest crops by lantern light. By the fourth day, the sleep deprivation had spawned strange behaviors. Old Tom the shepherd began herding cats instead of sheep, insisting they kept better time. The miller's wife took to staring at sundials and muttering about government conspiracies. Children played in the streets at ungodly hours, their laughter echoing through a village that no longer knew night from day. Clovis watched it all from his rooftop perch with quiet satisfaction. Let them understand what it felt like when their routines were shattered. Let them experience the disorientation of existing in a world without predictable markers. The fifth morning dawned, though only the sun seemed certain of this, to find the villagers gathered beneath the church roof, clutching offerings. "Please," Gundrick said, holding up a handful of choice grain. "We're sorry about everything." Eleanor presented a small cake shaped like a rooster, if the rooster in question had been stepped on. Even Thaddeus had brought something, a tiny helmet forged from scrap metal, which he insisted was just lying around, and definitely not made specifically for this occasion. Clovis regarded them all with one gleaming eye. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. Then, with the deliberate slowness of a monarch granting clemency, Clovis stretched his neck, fluffed his feathers, and let loose a crow so magnificent it shook apples from nearby trees. The villagers nearly wept with relief. As the sound faded, Clovis hopped down from his perch, pecked regally at the offerings, and strolled back toward the farmyard with the air of a labor leader who had just negotiated better working conditions. The next morning he crowed precisely at dawn, not because anyone expected him to, but because he chose to. And if some days he still crowed at passing clouds or existential dread, well, the villagers had learned not to complain. For their part, Bramblewick citizens developed a new appreciation for their feathery timekeeper. Gundrick left out extra grain near the fence post. The children stopped throwing stones. Even Thaddeus grudgingly admitted the rooster had a point about workers' rights, though he still jumped a foot in the air whenever Clovis appeared unexpectedly behind him. As for Clovis, he took to his duties with renewed vigor, his crows still unpredictable, still prone to philosophical tangents, but unmistakably his own. The village had learned its lesson. Time was not to be commanded, only negotiated with. And all good negotiations required respect, patience, and the occasional well-timed strike. Chapter 10. The Black Market of Alarm Alternatives. The great rooster strike of Bramblewick had left deep psychological scars. Though Clovis had eventually returned to his duties, on his own terms, with negotiated benefits, including extra grain and a strict no-chasing policy, the villagers would never again fully trust Avian timekeeping. A collective paranoia took root, one that whispered, What if he stops again? Yea, in the dark hours before dawn. Thus was born Bramblewick's most peculiar underground economy, the black market of alarm alternatives. It began innocently enough with water clocks. Thaddeus the blacksmith, still twitchy from unreliable wake-up calls, constructed a complicated device involving copper bowls and precise drips that theoretically would fill to a certain level, and then tip over with a clang at dawn. What Thaddeus hadn't accounted for was Bramblewick's hard water. By the third morning, the mechanism had calcified into immobility, leaving the blacksmith to wake at noon to find his invention now a very expensive mineral deposit. Undeterred, the villagers grew creative. Old Mother Wag, sensing a business opportunity, began selling guaranteed dawn detection leeches kept in special hourglass-shaped jars. There was sound. Leeches were known to become active at first light, but the execution left something to be desired. More than one villager woke to the unpleasant sensation of being the warmest breakfast option in the room. The leeches were quietly repurposed for medical use, though Brother Aldrich did briefly experiment with training them to grip tiny bells. The wealthier citizens turned to human alarm systems. A bidding war broke out for the services of the village's only town crier, a wheezy septuagenarian named Hubert, who could barely manage a whisper after his morning ale. His attempts at pre-dawn announcements mostly resulted in him coughing violently outside people's windows until they took pity and let him in for a restorative drink. By week's end, Hubert had made enough coin to retire and promptly moved to a warmer climate, leaving Bramblewick's elite without their prized, if ineffective, wake-up service. The less affluent resorted to animal substitutes. The miller's wife trained her terrier to bark at sunrise, which worked splendidly until the dog discovered moonlight and began sounding the alarm every 2 hours all night. The Cooper's geese showed promise until they developed a taste for sleeping villagers' toes. One particularly desperate farmer attempted to employ his goat, resulting in the now infamous incident of the Eton nightshirt. Children became an unexpected commodity. Eleanor the baker paid her neighbor's twins a penny a week to throw pebbles at her shutters at dawn. This worked until the children realized they could demand raises, at which point Eleanor began waking to what sounded like small rock slides against her home. The blacksmith's apprentice made a tidy profit, renting himself out as a living alarm by banging pots together outside homes, until he overslept one morning and an entire street missed prime. The monastery fared no better. Brother Aldrich, still smarting from his failed Rooster experiment, devised a system where novice monks would take shifts staying awake to watch the stars and ring the bells accordingly. This led to a spate of hallucinatory timekeeping, including one memorable midnight mass conducted at what the sleep-deprived monk on duty swore was definitely terse. The underground trade grew stranger by the day. A traveling merchant sold sunstones that allegedly grew warm at dawn. They didn't. The butcher's wife peddled dawn-detecting chicken feet that just pointed in random directions. Someone's uncle claimed he could wake at any appointed hour through sheer willpower, and spent a profitable week being hired as a living alarm before he was caught nosing through clients' pantries. Gundrick, ever practical, attempted to solve the problem through aggressive bedtime routines. He drank precisely 2 tankards of ale at dusk, ate exactly 7 bites of bread, and recited the same prayer before lying down in the same position each night. This resulted in him waking at inconsistent intervals to urinate, which was at least a kind of schedule. Through it all, Clovis observed the chaos with quiet amusement. He still crowed when the spirit moved him, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at the sight of a suspicious leaf. Once at a particularly moving sunset that reminded him of life's fleeting beauty. The difference now was that the villagers had stopped complaining. They'd learned the hard way that artificial alarms were no match for nature's original, even if nature's original came with existential baggage. The black market dwindled as Bramblewick citizens made their peace with uncertainty. Water clocks became decorative fountains. Leeches returned to their medical duties. The last professional wake-up caller retired after developing a conscience about his habit of faking dawn when he overslept. One by one the villagers returned to listening for Clovis Crow, not because it was reliable, but because it was real. And in a world full of failed inventions and false promises, there was something comforting about that, even if it did sometimes come at 3 in the morning. Next chapter preview. In Chapter 11, the Duke's royal decree, the neighboring nobility demands a reliable timekeeping solution, threatening to replace Clovis with a Swiss clockmaker's mysterious new invention. Chapter 11. The Jester's ill-timed joke. Lord Oswin's court had gathered in the Great Hall to discuss the Bramblewick timekeeping crisis, a phrase that had begun appearing in official correspondence with increasing alarm. The Duke from the neighboring province had sent yet another terse letter demanding to know why his grain shipments kept arriving at midnight, and Oswin's reputation as a competent ruler hung by a thread. The council chamber smelled of damp parchment and desperation. "We need a solution," Oswin declared, rubbing his temples where a headache had taken up permanent residence. "Something reliable, something dignified, something that doesn't involve existential poultry." The village elders shifted uncomfortably. Thaddeus the blacksmith had spent the morning fashioning a crude timepiece from spare gears and wishful thinking, which now sat on the table leaking oil onto important documents. Brother Aldrich clutched his prayer beads like they might divine the hour. Mother Wag had brought another suspicious potion, this one bubbling ominously in a flask labeled Iga Temporalis Fixus, which Aldrich quietly translated as probably just vinegar. It was the court jester, perched on his miniature throne in the corner, who finally broke the silence. "What about a screaming goat?" The room turned as one to stare at Fiddlebottom the fool, whose motley hat jingled as he grinned. Oswin blinked. "A what?" "A screaming goat." Fiddlebottom hopped down, bells jangling. "Marvelous creatures make this absolutely delightful noise when startled." Here he demonstrated a sound like a demon being stepped on, and they're much more reliable than roosters. "Also," he added conspiratorially, "you can milk them." A beat of silence followed. Gundrick, who had been invited as the resident rooster expert, a title he neither wanted nor deserved, spoke first. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Nonsense." Fiddlebottom flourished a hand toward the leaking timepiece. "The stupidest thing you've ever heard. My idea is agent second and stupidest at worst." Oswin, who had reached the stage of desperation where bad ideas started looking reasonable, stroked his chin. "A goat, you say?" And so, against all wisdom, the plan was set in motion. The goat arrived 3 days later, a shaggy, yellow-eyed beast named Percival, who smelled like bad decisions and had a stare that made children cry. The villagers gathered in the square to witness this bold new era in timekeeping, though Clovis notably abstained, choosing instead to watch from the roof of the blacksmith's shop with an expression of avian disgust. Fiddlebottom, thrilled with his sudden promotion from fool to agricultural consultant, had devised a system whereby Percival would be startled awake at dawn by a controlled drop of water on his hindquarters, triggering the scream that would rouse the village. It was, he assured everyone, foolproof. The first morning began with hope. The bucket tipped. The water fell. Percival screamed. It was, in fairness, an extremely effective alarm. Windows rattled. Birds took flight. Several villagers later swore they felt their bones vibrate. Unfortunately, Percival did not limit his screaming to dawn. The moment he realized noise got him attention, and more importantly, apples, he began screaming at everything, passing clouds, suspicious rocks, his own shadow. By midday, Bramblewick's residents were clutching their ears and re-evaluating their life choices. Clovis, meanwhile, had taken to following Percival at a safe distance, observing the chaos with what could only be described as professional interest. When the goat screamed at a particularly offensive daisy, Clovis tilted his head as if taking notes. Nightfall brought no reprieve. Unlike roosters, goats had no natural circadian rhythm to exploit. Percival screamed at midnight because he was bored. He screamed at 3 a.m. because he remembered an insult from earlier. He screamed at 5 because the moon looked at him funny. By the third day, the village resembled a battlefield. Dark circles haunted every face. The blacksmith was forging earplugs at a furious pace. Brother Aldrich had taken to muttering about goat-based apocalypses. Even Fiddlebottom, whose usual cheer was immune to reason, began eyeing Percival like a man reconsidering his life's work. The breaking point came when Percival had butted the water clock, now repaired and functioning, straight into the duck pond, then screamed triumphantly for 20 minutes straight. Oswin called an emergency meeting. "We," he announced to the haggard assembly, "have made a terrible mistake." Gundrick, who hadn't slept in 72 hours, simply nodded into his ale. The solution came from an unexpected source. Clovis knew. On the morning of the fourth day, as Percival drew breath for another outburst, the rooster finally intervened. With a single, perfectly timed crow, clear as a bell, precise as a sundial, he silenced the goat mid-scream. Percival blinked. The villagers held their breath. Clovis crowed again, louder this time, as if reminding everyone what a proper alarm sounded like. Percival, perhaps sensing he'd been outclassed, gave a half-hearted bleat and wandered off to eat someone's laundry. The message was clear. Fiddlebottom, to his credit, took the lesson gracefully. "Well," he said, adjusting his jingling hat, "it was worth a try." Oswin sighed. "Next time you have an idea, Fiddlebottom, perhaps don't." And so, with Percival's lease officially terminated, the goat was last seen boarding a merchant's cart in exchange for 2 apples and a promise never to return. Bramblewick returned to its imperfect but familiar rhythms. Clovis resumed his duties with renewed vigor, his crow still unpredictable, still prone to philosophical tangents, but blessedly free of caprine competition. The villagers, now intimately acquainted with worse alternatives, greeted each dawn with something approaching gratitude. As for Fiddlebottom, he was banned from animal-related suggestions for a full calendar year. A punishment he circumvented the very next week by proposing trained otters for mail delivery. But that, as they say, is another story. Chapter 12. The Rooster's Redemption Arc. The morning after Percival, the screaming goat departed Bramblewick in disgrace. The village awoke to an unfamiliar sound, silence. Not the anxious, watchful quiet of Clovis's strike, but a deeper stillness that made farmers sit bolt upright in bed, their subconsciouses whispering that something was profoundly wrong. Gundrick was the first to notice the empty perch. The fence post where Clovis normally held court stood bare, its wood still indented from years of talon grip. A search party, formed with the urgency of men who had only just realized they might have taken their feathery timekeeper for granted. They found Clovis in the apple orchard, standing atop an old stump with the posture of a philosopher king surveying his domain. His comb had lost some of its nervous droop. His feathers lay smoother. When the villagers approached, he turned his head slowly, not with the jerky panic of old, but with the measured dignity of a judge about to deliver a verdict. Then he crowed. It was nothing like his old cries, no existential warbling, no midnight shrieks of avian despair. This was a clear, crisp sound that cut through the morning mist like a blade through parchment. And when he finished, he gave the assembled villagers a look that said quite plainly, "You're welcome." The change was subtle but unmistakable. Clovis had not reformed. He had evolved. Gone was the neurotic fowl who crowed at shadows and his own mortality. In his place stood a rooster who had clearly done some soul-searching during his sabbatical and arrived at several pointed conclusions about the villagers' life choices. His new routine was impeccable. Dawn crows arrived precisely as the sun crested the hills, delivered with the reliability of a Swiss timepiece, if said timepiece could also judge you for sleeping past matins. Midday announcements came like clockwork, though now accompanied by a disdainful side-eye toward anyone lazing in the shade. Even his occasional philosophical outbursts had taken on a more structured form. One particularly memorable evening, he delivered a three-crow soliloquy on the fleeting nature of summer that left Brother Aldrich weeping into his psalter. The villagers, chastened by their failed experiments with goats and leeches and whatever unholy concoction Mother Wag had been peddling, treated this new Clovis with something approaching reverence. Farmers rose before his first crow, as if to prove they didn't need reminding. The blacksmith oiled his hinges to avoid squeaks that might draw feathered disapproval. Even Lord Oswin found himself straightening his tunic under the rooster's gaze, though he couldn't explain why. But with great punctuality came great arrogance. Clovis developed habits. If Gundrick overslept by so much as a minute, the rooster would crow directly into his earhole before strutting away with a flick of his tail feathers. When Eleanor's bread burned, a tragedy that coincided suspiciously with Clovis' mid-morning constitutional past her window, he clucked in a manner that suggested she'd brought this on herself. And the day Thaddeus dared suggest a mechanical alarm might still be useful, Clovis left a single pointed feather on the anvil, a feather that, when examined, somehow conveyed the message, "Itri me." The children were the first to embrace this new era. They followed Clovis in adoring packs, imitating his regal strut and attempting to replicate his crows with mixed success. A game called Judge Clovis became popular, wherein the rooster's reactions to various village misdeeds were treated as divine edicts. When little Tompkins was caught stealing apples, the children dragged him before Clovis' perch for sentencing. The rooster stared him down for a full minute before delivering a crow so withering the boy immediately returned the fruit and volunteered to weed gardens for a week. Even the animals fell in line. The hens stopped their idle gossip when Clovis passed. The miller's dog, previously a notorious chicken chaser, took to rolling onto his back in submission. Only Sir Crows-a-Lot, the pompous rooster from the neighboring farm, dared challenge the new order. A mistake he made exactly once before. Clovis pecked him so thoroughly he was briefly mistaken for a plucked Sunday dinner. Yet for all his newfound tyranny, the village thrived. Crops were planted on time. Bread rose perfectly. The blacksmith's work took on a new precision, as if the very nails feared Clovis's disapproval. Bramblewick became known as the best-kept village in the Shire, though visitors often remarked on the strange intensity of its residents' eyes, and how they all seemed to wake at the exact same moment. As for Clovis, he took his duties seriously, but not without flair. On the morning of the harvest festival, he delayed his crow just long enough for the entire village to gather in anticipatory silence before delivering a performance so magnificent the Duke's herald reportedly quit in shame. When winter came, he adjusted his schedule with impeccable seasonality, though his cold-weather crows carried an unspoken "Hi-Chewy, told you to mend your shutters months ago." And if, on rare nights when the moon was full and the wind carried the scent of distant fields, Clovis still sometimes crowed at nothing at all, well, the villagers had learned not to question it. For all his precision, he remained at heart a creature of mystery. And Bramblewick, at last, had learned to appreciate the difference between a clock and a rooster. One told time, the other commanded it. Chapter 13. The Invention of the Snooze Option. The problem with Clovis's newfound punctuality was its dreadful reliability. Where once the villagers had suffered under unpredictable but occasional outbursts, they now endured a rooster who greeted each dawn with the relentless precision of a tax collector. The first pale streaks of morning light became synonymous with a clarion call that brooked no argument, no negotiation, no mercy. It was the cooper's apprentice, a perpetually sleep-deprived youth named Edwin, who first dared to dream the forbidden dream. Whoa, yay! Well, my new sister for 10 says. The epiphany struck him during a particularly brutal morning, when Clovis's crow had jolted him from a dream about sleeping. As Edwin lay blinking in the pre-dawn gloom, the rooster strutted past his window, pausing just long enough to deliver a judgmental stare through the shutters. In that moment, as sleep's sweet embrace slipped through his fingers, Edwin conceived the most revolutionary idea in Bramblewick's history. He called it the sack method. The mechanics were simple in their brilliance. Position yourself near Clovis's perch at dawn. Wait for the first intake of breath that signaled an impending crow. Then, with the speed of a man gambling his future on 5 more minutes of sleep, throw a burlap grain sack over the rooster. The first attempt nearly ended in tragedy. Edwin misjudged the timing and received a beak to the wrist for his troubles. Clovis, affronted by this assault on his dignity, responded with a series of muffled shrieks that somehow conveyed more outrage through fabric than most creatures could manage unobstructed. But then, miracle of miracles, the sack worked. For 5 glorious minutes, the village existed in hushed anticipation. Edwin, clutching his bleeding hand, watched with awe as the burlap lump atop the fence post twitched with indignation but produced no sound. The sun rose a little higher. Birds that weren't currently trapped in makeshift silences sang their morning songs. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed contentedly. Then Clovis exploded. The sack went flying as the rooster emerged with all the fury of a minor deity denied tribute. His subsequent crow rattled shutters from the mill to the monastery, a sound so laden with vengeance that children instinctively hid under their beds. Edwin, showing wisdom unusual for an apprentice, immediately prostrated himself in the dirt. To everyone's astonishment, Clovis paused. He cocked his head, studying the groveling human before him. Then, with the air of a conqueror granting temporary clemency, he strutted away, leaving Edwin trembling in the dust. Word spread faster than plague. By noon, half the village had offered Edwin ale for details. By sundown, 3 separate sacks had been borrowed from the granary. The next morning saw Bramblewick's most coordinated civic effort since the great manure fire of the previous spring. A team of volunteers took positions around Clovis's perch, sacks at the ready. When the rooster stretched his wings for his first crow, he found himself buried under an avalanche of burlap, only to emerge 5 minutes later to discover the entire village feigning sleep with theatrical abandon. Clovis's eyes narrowed. Thus began the great Snooze War, a battle of wills that would redefine human-rooster relations. The villagers refined their technique with military precision. Lookouts took shifts monitoring Clovis's movements. Spotters tracked the sun's position. The blacksmith forged special sack-launching poles for those unwilling to risk their fingers. Clovis, for his part, adapted with terrifying intelligence. He took to pre-crowing from unexpected locations, the baker's chimney, the mill's water wheel, once from directly between Brother Aldrich's shoulder blades during morning prayers. He developed a 6th sense for approaching sacks, dodging them with the grace of a seasoned duelist. On particularly vindictive mornings, he would allow himself to be sacked, wait exactly 4.5 minutes, then unleash a crow so powerful it vaporized the burlap. The village responded with increasingly desperate innovations. Someone tried soaking the sacks in valerian root. Mother Wag contributed a sleepy time powder that mostly made Clovis sneeze. The miller's wife stitched together a giant quilted sack, which the rooster immediately claimed as his personal throne. After a fortnight of escalating hostilities, an uneasy truce was brokered by none other than Lord Oswin, who had grown tired of holding court to the sound of muffled avian profanity. The terms were simple: 1 sack per morning. 5 minutes exactly. Any attempts at subterfuge would result in Clovis being legally permitted to peck the offender's laundry off the drying line. The system works surprisingly well. Villagers got their precious extra sleep. Clovis got the satisfaction of watching humans grovel before his magnanimity. And Bramblewick gained its first true civic tradition, the morning sack toss, which would eventually evolve into an annual festival complete with sack races and a ceremonial crowing contest that no human ever won. As for Edwin, he enjoyed brief fame as the inventor of the snooze function before being promptly forgotten, as is the fate of all pioneers. His legacy lived on in every bleary-eyed villager who treasured those 5 stolen minutes, and in the knowing glint of Clovis's eye each dawn, as the rooster permitted his subjects this small rebellion before reminding them who truly ruled the mortal. Chapter 14. The King's Decree on Avian Labor Laws. The matter of Bramblewick's rooster situation had, through a series of increasingly baffling bureaucratic mishaps, reached the royal court. What began as a simple complaint from a sleep-deprived tax collector had, after passing through the hands of 3 dukes, an overzealous scribe, and one particularly dramatic minstrel, somehow transformed into a national crisis of avian labor rights. King Aldebrand the Reasonable, a title bestowed primarily because he had once pardoned a goose, sat upon his throne, rubbing his temples as his advisers bickered. The peasantry cannot function under these conditions, insisted the royal steward, waving a scroll that allegedly contained testimonies from Bramblewick's residents, though most were just drawings of angry roosters. The birds are clearly overworked, countered the royal zoologist, a man who had once tried to unionize the palace peacocks. Dawn crowing is one thing, but existential midnight soliloquies, that's clearly overtime. The king sighed. So what you're saying is, we need to regulate the roosters. A hush fell over the chamber. Thus was drafted the Avian Labor Accord of Bramblewick, a document so dense with clauses, subclauses, and poultry-related addendums that even the court scribes wept as they transcribed it. The key provisions were thus. 1. All roosters were henceforth to be recognized as official timekeeping professionals, with rights to fair compensation, grain, and reasonable working hours, dawn crowing only. 2. No rooster could be forced to crow outside contracted hours without appropriate rest periods and/or snacks. 3. Weekends were to be observed during which roosters were entitled to leisure activities such as dust baths, worm hunting, and staring judgmentally at passers-by. 4. Any attempts to sack, muffle, or otherwise silence a rooster during approved crowing hours would be punishable by royal decree. First offense, a sternly worded letter. Repeat offenses, being publicly shamed by a herald dressed as a chicken. The decree arrived in Bramblewick via a royal messenger who had clearly drawn the short straw. He unfurled the parchment with trembling hands, well aware that Clovis was watching from a nearby fence post with the intensity of a feathered barrister reviewing a contract. The village gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of hope and terror. Lord Oswin cleared his throat and began reading. Clovis listened, and listened, and listened. By the time Oswin reached the part about mandatory lunch breaks, the rooster's comb had turned an alarming shade of red. His talons flexed against the wood. His feathers puffed up in slow, deliberate increments like a storm cloud gathering over particularly litigious farmland. When the decree concluded with a flourish about fair feather practices, Clovis took flight. Not in panic, but in protest. He landed directly on the royal messenger's head, sending the poor man shrieking through the village with a flurry of wings and official documents. The message was clear. Clovis would not be unionized. What followed was the most peculiar labor dispute in medieval history. The king, determined to enforce his decree, dispatched a team of royal poultry regulators to Bramblewick. These unfortunate bureaucrats spent their days attempting to monitor Clovis' work hours, a task akin to documenting the migration patterns of smoke. Clovis, in turn, made sport of them. He crowed precisely at dawn, then again at dawn 30, just to prove he could. He accepted his government-mandated grain stipend with regal disdain, then scattered it in front of the hens like a feudal lord distributing alms. When the regulators attempted to enforce his weekend rights, he staged a one-rooster protest by crowing continuously for 12 hours straight, pausing only to peck at their official seals. The village, caught between royal decree and Rooster rebellion, quietly returned to their old rhythms. Farmers rose when Clovis crowed, regardless of the hour. The blacksmith forged unofficial, Clovis-approved sundials that always seemed to match the rooster's schedule. Even Lord Oswin took to signing documents with a little doodle of a crown-wearing chicken, just in case. Eventually, the king received a revised report from his exhausted regulators. It contained just 3 words, heavily underlined. It. Trau. Dodigato. And Sweden. And this. The Avian labor accord was quietly amended to include a special provision known as the Clovis Clause, which effectively granted all roosters the right to ignore human laws on principle. The royal messenger who delivered this update wore full chainmail beneath his tabard. As for Clovis, he celebrated his victory with a crow so magnificent it echoed clear to the next valley. Then, because he could, he took the rest of the day off. The villagers, wiser now, simply nodded and went about their business. After all, some forces of nature were beyond even kings. Chapter 15. The Rooster's Farewell Tour. The mechanical clock arrived in Bramblewick on a crisp autumn morning, carried by a traveling merchant who promised it would tick away all your temporal troubles. It was an ungainly thing of brass and gears, its face marked with numbers. The villagers still struggled to read, its pendulum swinging with the cold, unfeeling precision of progress. Clovis observed its installation from atop the church roof. At first the villagers clung to tradition out of stubbornness. They pretended not to hear the clock's sterile chimes. They set their routines by Clovis's crows, as they always had, turning their backs on the machine's metallic heartbeat. But slowly, inevitably, the rhythm of Bramblewick changed. Farmers rose at the clock's first chime, rather than waiting for Clovis's aria. The blacksmith timed his forge work to its hourly announcements. Even Brother Aldrich, of all people, began using it to mark the canonical hours, though he still crossed himself whenever Clovis crowed during Vespers, just in case. Clovis, for his part, did not go gently into obsolescence. He began his farewell tour with the subtlety of a conquering general revisiting old battlefields. He crowed at the first light of dawn, as always, but now with a theatrical flourish, holding notes longer, adding unnecessary vibrato, sometimes breaking into improvised cadenzas that left the chickens dumbstruck. He took to perching directly atop the new clock at unpredictable intervals, his shadow falling across its face like a feathered hour hand. When the blacksmith adjusted the clock's mechanism, Clovis waited until the man stepped back before unleashing a crow so perfectly synchronized with the chime that the 2 sounds merged into one surreal symphony. The villagers pretended not to notice. But on the morning of the harvest festival, the day the clock was to be officially christened as Bramblewick's new timekeeper, Clovis made his statement. As the mayor cleared his throat to begin the ceremony, as the children fidgeted with garlands, as the traveling merchant buffed his infernal machine with a proud cloth, Clovis strutted to the center of the square. The crowd fell silent. And then he sang. Not a crow, not really, something more. A sound that carried all the dawns he'd ever announced, all the storms he'd warned of, all the existential dread and stubborn joy of his tenure as Bramblewick's flawed, feathered heartbeat. It was slightly off-key in places. It lasted a beat too long. It was, in every way, imperfect. And when it ended, the clock struck noon. The 2 sounds, one living, one mechanical, hung in the air together for a moment, and in that space between chime and echo, the villagers remembered all the mornings Clovis had dragged them from sleep, all the chaos he'd caused, all the ways he'd shaped their lives not by precision, but by presence. Then the moment passed. The festival continued. The clock kept ticking. Clovis, his point made, retired to a life of leisure in the apple orchard, where the villagers made sure he wanted for nothing. Some claimed he still crowed sometimes, not at dawn, but at moments that felt like they needed marking, When a child took their first steps, when the first snow fell, when the old mill finally collapsed under the weight of its own years. And if, on quiet mornings when the wind was just right, the metallic chimes of the clock sometimes sounded suspiciously like they were answering an old rooster's challenge, well, that was surely just the gears settling. Progress, after all, marches forward. But tradition? Tradition knows when to crow.